They bullied the quiet boy, not knowing he's a martial arts master. What happens when the quiet kid in the corner has been hiding thunder in his chest all along? The hallways of Lincoln High stretch like concrete veins through a body that's forgotten how to breathe. Students flow in predictable currents, athletes claiming the center, popular kids marking their territory near the lockers, and everyone else finding their place in the carefully structured ecosystem of teenage hierarchy. But there's something different about the boy walking against the current this morning, something that makes the air itself seem to hold its breath. Ethan Martinez moves through the chaos like water, finding its path around stones. His oversized black hoodie swallows his frame, the hood pulled up just enough to cast shadows across features that rarely meet anyone's gaze. His backpack hangs loose on one shoulder, and his sneakers make no sound against the polished floor. A ghost navigating a world that has already decided he doesn't matter. But ghosts, as anyone who's ever felt truly haunted knows, often carry the heaviest stories. The first bell hasn't rung yet, but the morning ritual has already begun. Near the trophy case, where golden statues freeze athletes in moments of glory, Brad Kellerman holds court like a king, surveying his domain. 6'2" of carefully cultivated muscle and confidence, Brad wears his Letterman jacket like armor, the red and gold of Lincoln High's colors declaring his status to anyone who might have forgotten. His laugh cuts through conversations, drawing attention like a magnet draws metal. "Did you see the new kid yesterday?" Brad's voice carries that particular tone, the one that sounds casual but lands like a fist. Walking around like he's carrying the world on his shoulders, someone needs to teach him how things work around here. His crew nods with the synchronized approval of those who've learned that agreeing is safer than thinking. Marcus Chen, Brad's shadow since middle school, grins with teeth too white and eyes too empty. He looks like he'd blow over in a strong wind. They don't notice Ethan's hand tighten almost imperceptibly around his backpack strap. They don't see the microsecond pause in his step or the way his breathing shifts into something deeper, more controlled. These are details that would matter to someone trained to notice them, but bullies rarely look beyond the surface they're preparing to break. The morning sun streams through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the floor like prison bars. Ethan moves through them, in and out of shadow, a pattern that feels too symbolic to be accidental. Students part around him without thinking, the way crowds unconsciously avoid stepping on ants, not out of respect, but out of instinctive dismissal. In AP literature, Mrs. Henderson reads from Hemingway, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, some are strong at the broken places." The words hang in the air like prophecy, while Ethan stares at his notebook, pen motionless above blank paper. Behind him, Jessica whispers to her friend about weekend plans. But Ethan hears something else in the rhythm of her voice, the same cadence his grandfather used when teaching him about patience. "Patience, mijo." The old man's voice echoes in memory, weathered hands positioning Ethan's smaller ones into proper form. The mountain doesn't rush to meet the storm. It simply stands, and when the storm comes, it remembers what it's made of. But some storms don't announce themselves with thunder. The cafeteria at lunch feels like a coliseum, all eyes and appetites and unspoken hierarchies. Ethan sits alone at a corner table, methodically eating a sandwich, his grandmother packed with the kind of care that speaks in actions rather than words. The peanut butter is smooth, the jelly strawberry, the bread cut with edges that show attention to detail, normal things, safe things, things that belong to a world where boys can eat lunch without calculating escape routes. That's when Brad's shadow falls across his table. "Mind if we sit?" Brad doesn't wait for an answer, sliding into the seat across from Ethan with the confidence of someone who's never been told no. Marcus and two others form a semicircle, boxing Ethan in with practiced efficiency. Up close, Brad's smile reveals itself as something predatory. His eyes hold that particular gleam that comes from discovering a new toy to break. "You know, I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Brad. I basically run things around here." He gestures broadly, as if claiming ownership of the air itself. Ethan's sandwich remains halfway to his mouth, suspended in the moment before everything changes. He sets it down with deliberate care, his movements precise and economical in a way that might have meant something to someone who understood the language of controlled violence. "Ethan," he says quietly, his voice carrying just enough sound to be heard. "Ethan," Brad repeats, tasting the name like he's considering how it might sound when twisted into mockery. "That's a pretty name. Kind of gentle, don't you think, guys?" The laughter that follows has edges sharp enough to draw blood. Other students begin to notice, conversations tapering off as attention shifts toward the corner table where something is beginning to unfold. The cafeteria's energy changes, becoming electric with the anticipation that always precedes a public execution. "Where are you from, Ethan?" Brad leans forward, invading personal space with the casual cruelty of someone who's learned that comfort zones exist to be violated. "Because you've got this vibe, like you don't quite belong here." Ethan's hands rest flat on the table, positioned in a way that looks casual but isn't. Anyone trained in martial arts would recognize the stance: balanced, rooted, ready. But teenage bullies rarely study the subtleties of potential resistance. "Just moved here," Ethan responds, his voice steady despite the electricity building in the air around them. "Just moved here," Brad mimics, his tone shifting into something uglier. "From where? The library? A monastery?" More laughter, louder now, drawing additional observers like sharks to blood in the water. The fluorescent lights overhead buzz with electrical current, casting everything in harsh, unforgiving clarity. Ethan's face remains impassive, but something flickers behind his eyes, a depth that suggests storms weathered and lessons learned in places where laughter dies hard deaths. "You know what I think?" Brad stands, his height making him loom over the seated boy like a monument to teenage tyranny. "I think you need to understand how things work around here, and I think I'm just the guy to teach you." The cafeteria holds its breath. Phones emerge from pockets with the lightning speed of a generation raised on viral moments. Everyone seems to sense that something significant is about to happen, though none of them could guess the true magnitude of what's building beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary Tuesday. Ethan looks up then, his eyes meeting Brad's for the first time. For just a moment, something passes between them, recognition perhaps, or warning. But Brad, drunk on power and audience, misreads the message entirely. He reaches out to shove Ethan's shoulder, his hand moving with the casual violence of someone who's never faced real consequences. But what happens next will change everything, because sometimes the quiet ones aren't quiet because they're weak. Sometimes they're quiet because they know exactly what kind of noise they're capable of making. The memory hits Ethan like a physical blow, pulling him away from the cafeteria's fluorescent harshness into the golden warmth of his grandfather's backyard dojo. The transition happens in the space between heartbeats, between Brad's reaching hand and the moment that will define everything that follows. 5 years old, bare feet on weathered wooden planks, Ethan stumbles through his first kata, while his grandfather watches with eyes that have seen wars end and empires crumble. The old man's face is a roadmap of experience, each line earned through decades of discipline, loss, and hard-won wisdom. His hair, white as mountain snow, catches the late afternoon sun filtering through the cherry blossom tree that stands sentinel over their training ground. "Abuelo, why do we have to move so slowly?" Young Ethan's voice carries the impatience of childhood, the burning need to reach the destination without understanding the value of the journey. Rafael Martinez sets down his tea with the deliberate care of someone who has learned that even small actions deserve attention. His hands, scarred from decades of training and years of construction work, gesture for his grandson to come closer. "Tell me, mijo, what happens when you try to force a river to change its course?" The boy's forehead wrinkles with concentration. "It fights back?" "Exactly." The old man's smile holds depths that 7-year-old Ethan won't understand for years. "But what happens when you become the river?" In the present, Brad's hand moves through space toward Ethan's shoulder, but time feels elastic, stretched thin by memory and instinct. The cafeteria noise fades to white static as another memory surfaces, this one darker, tinged with the kind of pain that leaves permanent marks on the soul. Ethan at 12, standing over Tommy Reeves in the parking lot behind Miller's General Store. Tommy's nose streams blood, his expensive sneakers scuffed, his designer jacket torn at the shoulder. The other kids who had been laughing moments earlier now stare in stunned silence, their cruelty transformed into shock by the sudden reversal of power. I'm sorry? Tommy stammers, his voice breaking on the words. I didn't know you could. I mean, I was just... But Ethan isn't listening to the apology. He's staring at his own hands, these instruments his grandfather had trained for protection and discipline, now marked with another boy's blood. The taste of victory turns to ash in his mouth as he realizes what he's become in that moment. Exactly what his grandfather had warned him against. Violence is not the way, Ethan. His grandfather's voice, heavy with disappointment, cuts through the memory like a blade. I taught you these skills to build character, not to tear others down. What happened here? This is not who we are. The drive home had been silent except for the rhythmic squeak of the old Buick's windshield wipers fighting against a sudden spring rain. Ethan pressed his forehead against the cool window glass, watching the world blur into impressionist streaks of color and regret. His knuckles still ached, but that pain was nothing compared to the weight of his grandfather's silence. That night, kneeling in the dojo, while rain drummed against the roof, Ethan made a promise that would shape the next 6 years of his life. I will never use what you've taught me in anger again, abuelo. I swear it. His grandfather had nodded slowly, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he studied the boy who was learning the hardest lesson of all. That true strength often looks like restraint. Then you understand, mijo. The greatest victory is the fight you don't have to win. But promises made in childhood, Ethan is learning, become complicated by the realities of adolescence. The memories cascade faster now, a lifetime of training compressed into milliseconds. Early morning sessions before school, his breath visible in the cold air as he practiced forms older than his grandfather's grandfather. The meditative rhythm of heavy bag work, each strike precise and purposeful, building not just muscle memory, but moral fiber. Hours spent studying philosophy alongside physical technique, learning that true martial arts was as much about the spirit as the body. A warrior who seeks only victory has already lost, his grandfather would say, adjusting Ethan's stance with gentle pressure. But a warrior who seeks only peace, he becomes something greater than either. The old man's stories came in fragments, shared during water breaks or while they swept the dojo clean at day's end. Tales of his youth in the Philippines, where he learned from masters who treated martial arts as sacred trust. His immigration to America, carrying ancient knowledge in calloused hands and a heart full of hope. The years of building a family, a business, a legacy, measured not in trophies, but in character. I came here with nothing but these skills and the belief that they could help build something good, Raphael would say, his eyes distant with memory. Every technique I teach you carries the responsibility of generations. Use them wisely. But wisdom, Ethan is discovering, becomes complicated when the world insists on testing your resolve. In the cafeteria, Brad's hand continues its arc toward Ethan's shoulder, moving through a space filled with teenage cruelty and adult indifference. The observer part of Ethan's mind, the part trained through years of sparring and meditation, catalogues the bully's body language with clinical precision. Off balance, overconfident, telegraphing his intentions like a neon sign in the darkness. Another memory surfaces, his grandfather's final lesson, delivered just weeks before the old man's sudden heart attack. They had been working on advanced grappling techniques, moves designed to control without harm, to neutralize without devastating. Remember, Ethan, his grandfather had said, his breathing slightly labored in a way that should have been a warning. The highest level of martial arts is to subdue the enemy without fighting. But if you must fight... His eyes had grown serious, holding depths that spoke of experiences he'd never shared with his grandson. If you must fight, you do it once, completely, and with such clarity that no one ever questions your resolve again. The old man had paused then, studying Ethan's face with the intensity of someone memorizing precious details. But more important than knowing how to fight is knowing when not to. That wisdom, mijo, that's what separates warriors from thugs. 3 months later, Rafael Martinez died in his sleep, his heart finally giving out after decades of carrying the weight of knowledge, memory, and unconditional love. Ethan found him in the morning, peaceful in his bed, his weathered hands folded across his chest like he was still offering guidance, even in death. The funeral had been small but meaningful, attended by former students who spoke of lessons that extended far beyond physical technique. They shared stories of a man who had taught them not just how to fight, but how to live with honor, how to carry strength without arrogance, how to protect without destroying. But they hadn't prepared Ethan for this moment, sitting in a high school cafeteria while a bully's hand moves toward him with the lazy confidence of someone who has never faced real consequence. They hadn't taught him how to honor his grandfather's memory while drowning in the undertow of teenage violence. The weight of the promise he made as a 12-year-old presses down on him like gravity itself. Never again in anger, never again for pride, never again unless what? Unless the line gets crossed so completely that silence becomes complicity, unless restraint transforms from wisdom into cowardice, unless the very principles his grandfather taught him demand action rather than endurance. Brad's fingers are inches away now, close enough that Ethan can smell the artificial confidence radiating from him like cologne. The cafeteria holds its collective breath, phones raised and ready to capture whatever comes next. And in that suspended moment between memory and reality, between promise and necessity, Ethan Martinez prepares to discover what his grandfather's legacy truly means. Because sometimes the greatest act of peace requires a moment of perfectly controlled war. Wednesday morning arrives with the weight of revelation. Ethan walks through Lincoln High's front doors to discover that overnight fame has its own peculiar gravity. Conversations stop mid-sentence as he passes. Students who spent months looking through him now study his every movement with the intensity of scholars examining sacred texts. The hallways feel different, charged with an electricity that transforms mundane teenage interactions into something approaching ceremony. "That's him," whispers Carrie like wind through leaves. "That's the martial arts kid." The locker that had been vandalized twice in the past month now sports a small offering, an energy drink placed carefully on the narrow shelf, accompanied by a note written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like. A friend." Ethan stares at the gesture for a long moment, his trained hands steady despite the emotional earthquake occurring beneath his sternum. 6 months ago, his grandfather had spoken of respect as something that could never be demanded, only earned through consistent action and authentic character. The old man had never mentioned how heavy earned respect could feel when it arrived all at once. The first period passes in a blur of sideways glances and careful distance. Students maintain respectful space around him, no longer from dismissal, but from something approaching reverence. The teacher, Mrs. Patterson, acknowledges his presence with a nod that carries new weight, as if seeing him clearly for the first time, despite having shared a classroom for months. But it's the encounter outside the chemistry lab that provides the morning's first real test. Brad Kellerman stands alone near the water fountain, his usual entourage conspicuously absent. The confident posture that defined him for years has been replaced by something more complex, not exactly defeated, but fundamentally altered. He looks up as Ethan approaches, and for a moment time stretches thin between them. "Martinez," Brad says, his voice carrying none of its former edge. The single word hangs in the air like a question mark, loaded with unspoken acknowledgement of how drastically their dynamic has shifted. Brad. Ethan's response is neutral, professional, containing neither triumph nor hostility. The emotional discipline his grandfather instilled through years of training serves him well in this moment, allowing him to meet changed circumstances with equilibrium rather than emotion. About yesterday, Brad begins, then stops, his face cycling through expressions as he searches for words that don't exist in his previous vocabulary. Apology is foreign territory for someone who spent years believing that dominance eliminates the need for accountability. Students gather at a respectful distance, sensing the historic nature of what's unfolding. Phones emerge with practiced stealth, ready to capture whatever comes next in this ongoing social reformation. I was out of line. Brad continues, the admission clearly costing him something valuable. What I did to your grandfather's picture, that was wrong, really wrong. He pauses, his athlete's hands clenching and unclenching as he wrestles with concepts that challenge everything he thought he understood about power dynamics. You could have really hurt me yesterday, he says quietly, but you didn't. Even when He trails off, unable to voice the full scope of his behavior. Ethan studies Brad's face with the same careful attention his grandfather taught him to apply to studying opponents, not for weakness to exploit, but for truth to acknowledge. What he sees isn't the swaggering bully who has dominated Lincoln High's social ecosystem, but something more human and therefore more complex. Everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moment, Ethan says finally, his words carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Including you. The response isn't what Brad expected, and the surprise registers clearly across his features. In his world of winners and losers, mercy is an alien concept, forgiveness a sign of weakness rather than strength. I don't understand. Brad admits, you had every right to, after what I put you through. Understanding isn't required, Ethan replies, just choosing differently going forward. The crowd of observers begins to disperse as the bell approaches, but the ripple effects of the exchange spread through the hallways like seismic waves. By lunch, the story has evolved into something approaching legend. The quiet kid who not only defended himself but offered grace to his tormentor. The cafeteria at noon feels like neutral territory in a recently concluded war. Ethan sits at his usual corner table, but the isolation is now voluntary rather than imposed. Students approach throughout the meal, not to bother or intimidate, but to offer genuine connection. Hey, says Maria Santos, setting her tray down across from him with the careful politeness of someone seeking permission. Mind if I sit? I wanted to thank you for showing everyone that there are different ways to be strong. She's followed by David Kim, then Ashley Rodriguez, then others whose names Ethan is only beginning to learn. Each carries their own story of bullying endured, harassment witnessed, silence maintained when courage was needed. The table gradually fills with Lincoln High's formerly invisible population, kids who found their voices by watching someone else demonstrate that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud aggression. I tried to stick up for my sister once, David shares, his voice carrying the weight of old regret. Got my ass kicked for it, spent the rest of middle school keeping my head down. He pauses, studying Ethan with something approaching awe. Watching you yesterday, I realized I was confusing weakness with wisdom. The conversations continue through lunch and into the afternoon, each new connection adding weight to Ethan's understanding of what his moment of action has unleashed. He hasn't just defended himself, he's become a symbol for everyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of systematic cruelty. The final period brings an unexpected visitor. Principal Warren appears in the doorway of Ethan's English class, his expression unreadable as he beckons the boy into the hallway. Mr. Martinez, Warren begins, his administrative voice carrying undertones that suggest this conversation has been carefully planned. We need to discuss yesterday's events. Ethan follows the principal to his office, his mind automatically cataloguing potential consequences: suspension for fighting regardless of the circumstances, expulsion for disrupting school functions, administrative reactions that prioritize order over justice with depressing regularity. But Warren's office surprises him. Instead of disciplinary forms and stern warnings, he finds Coach Martinez, the PE teacher who shares his surname, along with a woman he doesn't recognize wearing the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being heard. "Ethan," Principal Warren says, settling behind his desk with uncharacteristic warmth, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Chen from the district's anti-bullying initiative. She's been reviewing the footage from yesterday's assembly." Dr. Chen extends her hand with professional grace. "Mr. Martinez, what you demonstrated yesterday was remarkable. Not just the physical skill, but the restraint. The way you controlled the situation without escalating it into actual violence." She pauses, studying his face with keen intelligence. "We'd like to talk to you about becoming part of our peer mediation program." The request hangs in the air like an invitation to transformation. Ethan feels the weight of expectation, the pressure of becoming something larger than himself, of accepting responsibility he never sought. "I just wanted them to stop," he says quietly. "And they did," Dr. Chen replies. "But more than that, you showed an entire school community that there are alternatives to either violence or victimhood. That's a lesson worth sharing." The meeting concludes with possibilities rather than punishments, training sessions for conflict resolution, speaking opportunities at other schools, the chance to transform a moment of defensive action into ongoing advocacy for those who need protection. As Ethan walks home through neighborhoods that feel familiar, yet somehow changed, he carries the weight of unexpected responsibility. His phone buzzes constantly with messages from strangers, friend requests from across the country, interview requests from local media outlets hungry for feel-good stories. But it's the text from his grandmother that stops him on the sidewalk outside their small house. "Your grandfather would be proud, mijo, not just of your strength, but of your heart." The evening finds him in the backyard dojo, his grandfather built, with weathered hands and endless patience. The wooden floor still bears scuff marks from thousands of hours of training. The air still carries the faint scent of the liniment the old man used for aching joints. Ethan moves through the forms his grandfather taught him, each technique flowing into the next with the natural rhythm of breathing. But tonight, the movements carry new meaning. They're no longer just exercises in discipline or preparations for hypothetical conflicts. They've become something approaching prayer, gratitude for lessons learned, wisdom inherited, and the courage to use both when the moment demanded action. As the sun sets behind the cherry blossom tree that has watched over this sacred space for decades, Ethan understands that his journey is just beginning. The quiet boy who wanted only to disappear has become visible in ways he never imagined. The responsibility is daunting, but it's tempered by the knowledge that he carries his grandfather's legacy with honor. The world will always have bullies, people who mistake cruelty for strength, dominance for leadership, fear for respect. But it will also have protectors, those who understand that true power serves others, that real strength lifts rather than crushes, that the greatest victories often look like peace. Standing in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the tools and wisdom of generations, Ethan Martinez finally understands what his grandfather meant when he said that warriors fight not for glory, but for the chance to make fighting unnecessary. The quiet boy has found his voice, and when he speaks, the world listens. If this story touched you, share in the comments what moved you most, and send this video to someone who needs to hear it today. Brad's hand connects with Ethan's shoulder, not the violent shove he intended, but a testing push, the kind predators use to measure their prey's willingness to resist. The contact lasts less than a second, but it's enough to shift the entire dynamic of the cafeteria. Conversations die mid-sentence. The scraping of chairs against linoleum stops. Even the kitchen staff pause in their cleanup, sensing that something significant is crystallizing in the space between these two boys. Ethan doesn't move, doesn't flinch, doesn't even acknowledge the contact, except for the slightest tightening around his eyes. A micro-expression that someone trained in reading body language might recognize as calculation rather than fear. "See that?" Brad announces to his audience, his voice carrying the triumphant tone of someone who believes he's just proven a point. Doesn't even have the spine to stand up for himself. The laughter that follows has a different quality now, hungrier, more vicious, fed by the scent of vulnerability in the water. But they're wrong about what they're seeing. Ethan's stillness isn't submission. It's the same quality a coiled spring possesses just before it releases. His grandfather's training echoes in the space between his heartbeats. True power whispers while weakness shouts. The days that follow blur together in a montage of systematic humiliation. Brad, emboldened by what he perceives as an easy victory, begins to incorporate Ethan into his daily routine of dominance. A shoulder check in the hallway here, a backpack accidentally knocked to the floor there. Small cruelties designed to establish hierarchy without crossing lines that might attract adult intervention. And Thursday morning, chemistry class. Mr. Peterson drones through the periodic table while Brad sits 3 rows behind Ethan, launching paper balls with the precision of someone who's elevated harassment to an art form. Each projectile carries a whispered insult: loser, freak, invisible boy. The other students pretend not to notice, their silence as much a part of the ritual as Brad's aggression. Ethan catalogues each impact with the same methodical attention his grandfather taught him to apply to studying opponents' patterns. Brad favors his right side. He telegraphs his movements with micro-expressions of anticipation. He draws energy from audience reaction. These observations file themselves away in Ethan's mind like tactical intelligence, though he tells himself he's gathering them for avoidance rather than confrontation. Friday afternoon, PE class becomes theater. Coach Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, divides the class for dodgeball with the casual indifference of someone who stopped caring about student dynamics years ago. Brad immediately positions himself across from Ethan, his grin promising violence disguised as sport. The whistle blows. Rubber spheres fill the air like meteors, but Brad has eyes only for one target. His first throw comes in fast and high, aimed not at elimination, but at humiliation. Ethan sidesteps with fluid grace, the ball whistling past his ear close enough to disturb his hair. Lucky, Brad calls out, already reaching for another projectile. The second throw targets Ethan's legs, meant to trip rather than tag. Again, Ethan moves, not with the panicked scrambling of typical victims, but with an economy of motion that belongs in a different kind of arena entirely. Students begin to notice. Whispers start spreading through the gym like ripples in still water. By the third miss, Brad's face has shifted from predatory amusement to something darker. His throws become wilder, more aggressive, each miss feeding a frustration that threatens to boil over into something actionable. But Ethan continues to flow around the attacks like water around stones, never quite where the ball expects him to be. "What's wrong, Martinez?" Brad's voice carries across the gym, loud enough to draw coach's attention, too scared to stand still and take it like a man. The irony of the taunt isn't lost on anyone paying attention. Here stands Brad, growing more frustrated by the minute because he can't hit a stationary target, questioning someone else's courage. But teenage logic rarely concerns itself with consistency. Coach's whistle ends the torment, but not before half the class has witnessed something they can't quite name, a demonstration of capability that exists in the spaces between actions, in movements that shouldn't be possible for someone who's supposed to be helpless. The weekend provides temporary refuge, but Monday arrives with the inevitability of gravity. Brad's campaign has evolved, grown more sophisticated. He's recruited allies beyond his usual crew, turning Ethan's isolation into a group project. The cafeteria boycott begins, students warned away from sitting near the weird kid. Bathroom encounters where escape routes are blocked and personal space is invaded with calculated precision. You know what your problem is? Brad corners Ethan near the library stacks during lunch, his voice low enough to avoid detection, but clear enough to carry its message of escalating threat. You think you're better than everyone else, walking around all mysterious and quiet, like you've got some big secret. Marcus flanks Ethan's other side, completing the human cage that's become their signature move. Maybe we should help him find his voice, he suggests, with the kind of smile that belongs in horror movies. But it's the third member of today's harassment committee who provides the real revelation. Derek Chen, Marcus's younger brother, a freshman trying to prove himself worthy of upperclassmen attention. His presence signals something new in the dynamic, an escalation that speaks to careful planning rather than opportunistic cruelty. I heard he talks to himself, Derek contributes, his voice carrying the eager-to-please tone of someone desperate for acceptance. Mrs. Rodriguez says he mutters under his breath in Spanish class, probably planning something weird. The comment hangs in the air like smoke, toxic and spreading. Ethan feels something shift inside his chest. Not anger exactly, but recognition. They're moving beyond simple bullying into character assassination, building a narrative that could follow him for years. Is that right? Brad steps closer, close enough that Ethan can smell the artificial fruit of his energy drink, can count the pores in his skin. What kind of things are you planning, Ethan? The question carries weight beyond its words. In a post-Columbine world, whispers about quiet kids planning something can destroy lives even when they're completely unfounded. Ethan recognizes the shift from personal harassment to social assassination, and for the first time since arriving at Lincoln High, he feels something crack in the careful control he's maintained. His grandfather's voice echoes across the years. A warrior fights for others, not for himself, but when the fight comes to him, he meets it with total commitment. Tuesday brings the science fair, and with it, an opportunity for public humiliation on a scale Brad hasn't yet achieved. Ethan's project, a demonstration of physics principles through martial arts movements, sits alone at table 17 while other presentations buzz with visitors and judges. The isolation isn't accidental. Word has spread through the carefully managed social network that approaching Ethan Martinez might carry social consequences. Brad's project occupies the prime real estate near the entrance, a flashy display about sports nutrition that's clearly been assembled by someone with more money than genuine interest. But it's not the project that holds his attention, it's the opportunity. Tables full of spectators, parents with cameras, teachers paying attention. The perfect stage for a performance that will cement his dominance once and for all. Ladies and gentlemen, Brad announces, his voice carrying the theatrical projection of someone comfortable with attention. I think we should all hear from our school's most mysterious student. Heads turn, cameras raise. The crowd that's been politely circulating through the displays begins to coalesce around table 17 like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Ethan finds himself at the center of a circle that feels less like audience than jury. Come on, Ethan. Brad continues, his smile razor-sharp with manufactured friendliness. Tell everyone about your interesting project here. The setup is perfect. Public enough to ensure maximum humiliation, official enough to prevent easy escape, crowded enough to guarantee viral documentation. Brad has learned from his previous encounters, evolved his tactics to ensure this moment will follow Ethan for the rest of his high school career. But what Brad doesn't understand, what none of them understand, is that some demonstrations of physics are best experienced rather than explained, and sometimes the quiet kid in the corner isn't planning anything at all. Sometimes He's simply waiting for the right moment to show the difference between stillness and surrender, because the storm that's been building in Ethan's chest for weeks is about to find its voice. And when it speaks, everyone will finally understand what they've been dealing with all along. The gymnasium transforms into an amphitheater of expectation. 500 students packed into bleachers that creak under the weight of teenage energy and administrative obligation. Principal Warren's voice echoes through the sound system, delivering the monthly assembly's opening remarks about school spirit and academic excellence. But nobody's really listening. The real entertainment waits in the spaces between official programming, in the social dynamics that play out under fluorescent lights and adult supervision. Ethan sits in the third row, his position chosen for invisibility rather than engagement. The hoodie is up again, creating a private cave in the midst of public chaos. Around him, conversations flow like water around a stone. Friend groups planning weekend adventures, couples negotiating relationship drama, the endless chatter of youth trying to fill silence with noise. But 3 rows behind him, Brad Kellerman orchestrates something different entirely. You see him sitting there. Brad's voice carries just far enough to reach his intended audience without attracting faculty attention. Like he owns the place, someone needs to remind him where he stands in the food chain. The plan unfolds with the meticulous precision of someone who's elevated cruelty to a science. Marcus has positioned himself at the end of Ethan's row, blocking the most obvious escape route. Derek Chen sits directly behind their target, close enough to provide physical intimidation when the moment arrives. 2 other conspirators, Jenny Walsh and Tyler Brooks, occupy strategic positions with phone cameras ready, ensuring every moment will be preserved for digital eternity. Remember, Brad whispers to his assembled crew, we wait until Warren starts talking about respect and kindness. Maximum irony points. The setup is perfect, public enough to guarantee an audience, official enough to prevent immediate retaliation, timed for maximum psychological impact. Brad has learned from his previous encounters with Ethan, evolved his approach to account for the boy's unusual ability to avoid direct confrontation. What he hasn't accounted for is the particular way trauma crystallizes under pressure. Principal Warren's voice shifts into the familiar cadence of administrative, moral instruction. At Lincoln High, we believe in treating every student with dignity and respect. Bullying has no place in our community, and we expect each of you to stand up for your fellow students when you see harassment taking place. The irony hangs in the air like smog. Brad grins, recognizing his cue. He starts small. A paper airplane that lands in Ethan's hood, crafted from a page torn from his algebra notebook and decorated with crude insults in black ink. Loser, written in block letters across the wingspan. Invisible boy, scrawled along the fuselage. The projectile hits its mark with surgical precision, drawing snickers from nearby students who are beginning to sense entertainment. Ethan doesn't turn around, doesn't acknowledge the assault. His breathing remains steady, controlled, the kind of rhythmic inhalation his grandfather taught him during meditation sessions. But something flickers behind his eyes. A calculation, perhaps, or recognition that the moment he's been dreading and preparing for has finally arrived. The second airplane carries a different message. Your grandfather would be ashamed. The words hit harder than any physical blow, striking directly at the core of everything Ethan carries. His hands clench involuntarily, knuckles whitening with the effort of maintaining control. Principal Warren continues his speech about community and kindness, while Brad escalates his performance. The third airplane becomes a guided missile, aimed not at Ethan's hood, but at his head, the corner striking just behind his ear with enough force to sting. This time, Ethan's reaction is visible, a slight forward movement, a tightening of shoulders that speaks to muscles preparing for action. What's wrong, Martinez? Brad's voice carries just loud enough to reach the surrounding students, but not quite loud enough to interrupt the principal's monologue. "Cat got your tongue, or are you just too scared to turn around?" The audience begins to coalesce. Students in nearby rows shift their attention from Warren's speech to the developing drama. Phones emerge from pockets with practiced stealth, recording devices becoming as ubiquitous as breathing in a generation raised on viral content. But it's the fourth airplane that changes everything. This one carries a photograph, printed on regular copy paper, but clear enough to be recognizable. Ethan's grandfather, Rafael Martinez, captured in the local newspaper's obituary section 6 months earlier. The image has been defaced with red marker, horns drawn on the old man's head, devil's tail added to his dignified pose. The paper strikes Ethan's shoulder and unfolds, the desecrated image of his grandfather landing face up on his lap like a judgment. For a moment, the gymnasium falls away. The assembly noise fades to white static. The careful control he's maintained for months cracks like ice under sudden pressure. His breathing changes first, shallow and rapid, the kind of respiratory shift that precedes fight-or-flight activation. His vision narrows, peripheral awareness contracting, until the world consists only of the photograph and the rage building behind his sternum like a nuclear reaction seeking release. "That's it," Brad announces, his voice now loud enough to draw attention from students several rows away. He stands, using his height and position to create a physical presence that transforms the harassment from covert to overt. "Turn around and face me, you coward." The word echoes in the space between heartbeats. Coward. The one accusation his grandfather had taught him never to accept, never to internalize, never to leave unanswered when honor demanded response. Ethan turns. The movement is fluid, economical, containing none of the jerky anger typical of teenage confrontation. He pivots in his seat with the controlled grace of someone whose body has been trained to respond to threats with precision rather than passion. When his eyes meet Brad's, something passes between them, recognition perhaps, or the sudden understanding that this moment will define everything that follows. "There he is," Brad says, his voice carrying the tone of someone who believes he's already won. The invisible boy finally shows his face. The photograph of his grandfather lies crumpled in Ethan's lap, the red marker defacement like wounds on sacred ground. Around them, the audience grows larger, more attentive, sensing that the entertainment is about to escalate beyond anything they've witnessed before. Principal Warren's speech continues in the background, his words about respect and dignity creating a surreal soundtrack to the confrontation building in the bleachers. "We must remember that words have power," his voice echoes through the sound system, "and we are all responsible for the emotional safety of our fellow students." Brad takes a step down the bleacher, moving into Ethan's row with the confidence of someone who has never faced real consequence for his actions. Marcus moves to flank him, while Derek provides backup from behind. The formation is strategic, designed to prevent escape and maximize intimidation. "You know what your problem is, Martinez." Brad's voice has dropped to the register reserved for serious threats, low enough to avoid adult detection, but clear enough to carry its message to every student within earshot. "You think you're special, different, better than the rest of us." He gestures to the crumpled photograph. "But you're not. You're just another loser whose family couldn't even stick around to protect him." The insult lands like a physical blow, targeting not just Ethan, but the memory of the man who raised him, who taught him everything about honor and discipline and the responsibility that comes with power. The rage that's been building in his chest crystallizes into something harder, more focused, more dangerous than simple anger. Ethan stands. The movement is controlled, economical, but there's something in the way he rises that makes the students around him unconsciously lean back. His posture shifts into something that might look casual to untrained eyes, but carries the unmistakable signature of someone whose body has been weaponized through years of disciplined training. "Sit down," Brad commands, But for the first time, his voice carries a note of uncertainty. Something in Ethan's demeanor has changed. Some fundamental shift that transforms him from victim to something altogether more complex. The gymnasium falls silent around them. 500 students suddenly aware that they're witnessing something unprecedented. Phones rise like flowers seeking sunlight, capturing every angle of the confrontation that's about to redefine the social hierarchy of Lincoln High School forever. Principal Warren's voice continues its ironic counterpoint. When we see injustice, we must find the courage to act. Silence in the face of cruelty makes us complicit in the harm being done. Ethan looks down at the defaced photograph of his grandfather, then back at Brad, with eyes that hold depths the bully has never seen before. When he speaks, his voice carries the quiet authority of someone who has finally decided that some lines once crossed demand a response. "You made a mistake," he says simply. And in that moment, everyone in the gymnasium understands that they're about to witness something that will be talked about for years to come. Because sometimes the quiet kid isn't quiet because he's weak. Sometimes he's quiet because he knows exactly what kind of storm he's capable of unleashing. Time fractures. Brad's hand moves toward Ethan's chest, fingers spread wide in preparation for the shove that will send the weird kid tumbling backward into the bleachers. It's meant to be the final punctuation mark on weeks of systematic humiliation, the decisive moment that will cement his dominance in front of 500 witnesses. But the hand never makes contact. What happens next unfolds in the space between seconds, a demonstration of physics and philosophy that transforms the gymnasium from amphitheater to temple. Ethan's response flows like water finding its level, each movement precise and inevitable as gravity itself. The first motion is barely visible, a subtle shift of weight that takes Ethan's torso out of Brad's reach by exactly the margin necessary and no more. The bully's hand grasps empty air while Ethan glides sideways like smoke given form. Students in the immediate vicinity blink, uncertain whether they've witnessed movement or illusion. "What the—" Brad begins, but the words dissolve as his forward momentum carries him off balance. His athletic coordination, honed through years of football training, suddenly feels clumsy and inadequate against someone who moves according to entirely different principles. Ethan's hand rises with the gentle precision of a flower turning toward sunlight. Palm open, fingers relaxed, the gesture looks almost meditative until it makes contact with Brad's extended arm. The touch is light as a whisper, but the effect is immediate and devastating. Brad's aggressive lunge transforms into an uncontrolled stumble as his own force is redirected along vectors he never saw coming. The physics are simple. Force plus leverage equals inevitability. But the execution is poetry written in motion, each adjustment flowing seamlessly into the next like notes in a symphony only Ethan can hear. Brad staggers 3 steps sideways before his shoulder meets the metal support beam of the bleachers with a resonant clang that echoes through the suddenly silent gymnasium. The impact isn't violent. There's no bone-crushing collision or dramatic crash. Instead, it carries the matter-of-fact finality of natural law asserting itself. For a moment, Brad hangs there against the beam, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the dawning recognition that he has fundamentally misunderstood what he was dealing with. Around him, 500 students sit in stunned silence, their phones capturing every frame of an encounter that defies their understanding of social hierarchy. "How did you—" Brad pushes off from the beam, his voice carrying a note of something that might be fear if he were capable of recognizing it in himself. But pride and confusion merge into a toxic cocktail that drives him forward again, this time with the desperate aggression of someone whose worldview is crumbling in real time. Marcus steps in from the side, his loyalty to Brad overriding whatever survival instincts might be whispering warnings. He moves with the practiced coordination of someone who's participated in enough group confrontations to know the value of overwhelming force. His approach is tactical, designed to catch Ethan between opposing threats. But Ethan doesn't seem concerned with tactics. Instead, he moves like someone dancing to music only he can hear. The step that takes him away from Marcus's grabbing hands also positions him perfectly to intercept Brad's second attack. The bully comes in high and hard this time, abandoning any pretense of casual harassment in favor of pure aggression. His fist cuts through the air where Ethan's head should be, but the target has already relocated to somewhere physics says is impossible. Ethan drops low, his center of gravity shifting in a way that seems to violate the laws of human locomotion. The movement is primal, cat-like, containing echoes of techniques developed in training halls where combat was philosophy and philosophy was survival. Brad's punch whistles overhead while Ethan flows beneath it like tide rushing under a bridge. The counterattack comes from an angle that shouldn't exist. Ethan's palm finds the pressure point just below Brad's ribcage with surgical precision. Not hard enough to cause lasting damage, but with sufficient accuracy to convince the bully's nervous system that breathing is suddenly optional. The contact lasts less than a heartbeat, but Brad doubles over as if he's been hit by a truck. Marcus, seeing his friend folding, launches himself forward with the desperate courage of someone trying to save a drowning man. His tackle should connect. The angle is perfect, the timing flawless, the distance optimal for overwhelming force, meeting surprised target. But Ethan isn't there anymore. The sidestep happens in the space between thought and action, a movement so economical it seems like digital editing. Marcus's arms close around empty air, while his momentum carries him past his intended target and directly into the path of Derek Chen, who has been climbing down from the row behind with his own aggressive intentions. The collision between the two conspirators produces a tangle of limbs and confusion that would be comedic if the situation weren't so surreal. They go down in a heap of designer clothing and bruised egos, their careful coordination dissolved by the simple reality that their target refuses to occupy the space they've designated for him. Ethan stands in the center of it all, his breathing steady and controlled, his posture relaxed, despite having just dismantled 3 attackers without throwing a single offensive strike. He looks down at Brad, who remains doubled over and struggling to remember how respiratory systems function, then at the tangle of Marcus and Derek trying to sort themselves into individual humans again. The gymnasium has become a cathedral of silence. 500 students sit motionless, their phones recording but their minds struggling to process what they've witnessed. Teachers along the sidelines lean forward, their administrative instincts warring with simple human fascination at the display of controlled violence they've just observed. Principal Warren's voice continues through the sound system, his words about community and respect providing surreal counterpoint to the tableau playing out in the bleachers. True strength comes not from our ability to dominate others, but from our capacity to lift them up. Ethan reaches into his pocket and withdraws the crumpled photograph of his grandfather. He smooths it carefully, his fingers tracing the red marker defacement with the reverence of someone tending a sacred wound. When he looks up, his eyes find Brad's with an intensity that makes the bully flinch, despite his position on the metaphorical ground. My grandfather taught me that violence should always be the last option, Ethan says, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed gymnasium. But he also taught me that some disrespect demands an answer. He holds up the photograph so everyone can see the desecration, the red horns and devil's tail drawn across the dignified face of an old man who died believing the world could be better than it was. This, Ethan continues, his voice growing stronger, more certain, crossed a line you should never have approached. Brad straightens slowly, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine searching for the right combination. The easy confidence that carried him through years of social dominance has evaporated, replaced by the dawning understanding that he's been playing checkers while his opponent has been thinking in chess. Around them, the audience begins to stir. Whispers start spreading through the bleachers like ripples in disturbed water. Phones continue recording, capturing not just the physical confrontation, but the moment when Lincoln High School's social order reshuffled itself according to entirely new rules. Because what the students have witnessed isn't just a fight, it's a revelation. The quiet kid in the corner wasn't hiding weakness, he was containing power. The boy they dismissed as invisible has just demonstrated a form of visibility that none of them will ever forget. And in that moment of crystalline clarity, everyone understands that Ethan Martinez was never the victim in this story. He was simply the storm, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone what respect actually looks like. The question now isn't whether Brad will try again. It's whether anyone at Lincoln High will ever see Ethan the same way again. The first video uploads before the assembly even ends. Jenny Walsh's iPhone captures the entire sequence from the perfect angle. Brad's confident approach, the impossible fluidity of Ethan's response, the stunned silence that follows. She hits share with trembling fingers, her caption reading simply, "OMG, you have to see this. Quiet kid just destroyed the school bully without even trying. Lincoln High martial arts don't mess." By the time Principal Warren dismisses the assembly 15 minutes later, the video has 37 views and climbing. Students file out of the gymnasium in clusters, their conversations electric with the energy that only comes from witnessing something unprecedented. But there's a new dynamic in their movement patterns. A careful awareness of where Ethan Martinez walks, a respectful distance that speaks to fundamentally altered social calculations. "Did you see his face when it happened?" Sarah Chen whispers to her friend near the exit doors. "Brad looked like he'd seen a ghost. I've never seen anyone move like that. My cousin does MMA." Tyler responds, his voice carrying newfound respect. "Even he doesn't flow like that. That wasn't just training. That was art." Ethan moves through the dispersing crowd like a ship cutting through calm waters. Students part naturally around him, no longer from dismissive indifference, but from something approaching reverence. The invisibility he's cultivated for months has transformed into hypervisibility, every step tracked by eyes that are finally seeing him clearly. In the hallway outside the gymnasium, Brad leans against a locker bank, his breathing finally returning to normal, but his confidence shattered into fragments. Marcus and Derek flank him like bodyguards protecting wounded royalty, their own encounters with physics leaving them subdued and philosophical. "How did he do that?" Derek asks, his voice small with genuine confusion. "I mean, you're twice his size, Brad. You play varsity football. You bench 225. How does someone that small just make you disappear like that?" Brad doesn't answer because he doesn't have an answer. The encounter has left him with more questions than a teenage ego can process. Everything he understood about power dynamics, about physical dominance, about the natural order of high school hierarchies, has been rewritten in the space of 30 seconds. The video spreads through Lincoln High's social ecosystem like wildfire in drought conditions. By lunch period, it's been shared 47 times within the school network alone. Students gather in clusters around phones, re-watching the impossible sequence, analyzing each movement like scholars studying ancient texts. "Look at this part," Amanda Rodriguez says, pausing the video at the moment Ethan redirects Brad's momentum. "See how he doesn't even look like he's trying? It's like Brad just decides to throw himself into the wall." "Run it again," someone calls from the growing crowd around her table. "I want to see the thing he does with Marcus." The cafeteria has transformed into an impromptu film festival, every screen playing variations of the same 3-minute masterpiece. The footage quality varies, some shot from phones held by steady hands, others shaky with excitement, but the content remains consistently mind-bending. Mrs. Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher who's been quietly observing Ethan for weeks, watches one of the videos on a student's phone with growing understanding. She recognizes the controlled breathing, the centered posture, the way his movements flow from some deeper source than simple physical training. That boy, she murmurs to herself, carries old knowledge. But it's when the video escapes Lincoln High's closed ecosystem that everything changes. Tyler's older brother, home from college for the weekend, shares it on his Instagram with 2,300 followers. His caption reads, "Little bro sent me this. Kid at his high school just became a legend. This is what real martial arts looks like." From there, the video enters the vast digital ocean, where content lives or dies by algorithmic decree. But some stories carry their own momentum, and by evening, Lincoln High martial arts is trending in 3 states. Ethan knows none of this as he sits in his grandmother's kitchen, methodically eating the dinner she's prepared, with hands that show no sign of the afternoon's encounter. Rice and beans, perfectly seasoned, grilled chicken with the crispy skin she knows he loves, simple food prepared with the kind of care that speaks in actions rather than words. "How was school today, mijo?" she asks, settling across from him with her own plate and the patient attention of someone who has learned to read between the lines of teenage communication. "Different," Ethan responds, and the single word carries enough weight that she raises an eyebrow. Different how? He considers the question while chewing, his grandfather's training in mindful eating giving him time to process the day's events. How does he explain that he spent months becoming invisible only to become the most visible person at Lincoln High in 30 seconds? How does he articulate the complex emotions of honoring his grandfather's memory while possibly betraying his grandfather's philosophy? "I think some people finally saw me today," he says eventually. His grandmother studies his face with eyes that have witnessed 8 decades of human complexity. She sees the tension around his mouth, the careful way he holds his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands that speaks to adrenaline finally working its way out of his system. "And how do you feel about being seen?" The question hangs in the kitchen air like incense, sacred and requiring honest response. Ethan sets down his fork, considering not just the words but the weight they carry. "Scared," he admits, "and relieved, and guilty." He pauses, searching for precision in language the way his grandfather taught him to search for precision in movement. Abuelo always said the best fight is the one you don't have to win. But what if not fighting means other people get hurt? She reaches across the table to cover his hand with hers, weathered fingers providing anchor in the storm of his confusion. "Your grandfather was a wise man, but he lived in different times. Maybe the lesson isn't about never fighting. Maybe it's about fighting for the right reasons." Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Brad Kellerman sits in his bedroom, staring at his phone, as notification after notification pings with views and shares and comments that dissect his humiliation with surgical precision. The video has been slowed down, analyzed, turned into memes that will outlive his high school career. "Brad got sent to the shadow realm," reads one comment with 47 likes. "Dude learned what be water actually means," reads another. But it's the comment from Coach Martinez, 47, that makes his blood run cold. "Mr. Kellerman, we need to discuss your behavior toward other students. My office, tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. The notification count climbs toward 4 digits as the evening progresses. Local news stations pick up the story. Martial arts forums dissect the technique. Anti-bullying advocates share it as an example of peaceful resistance. The video becomes larger than the moment that created it, transforming into symbol and metaphor and cautionary tale. By midnight, Lincoln High Martial Arts has over 50,000 views across all platforms. Ethan Martinez, who spent months trying to disappear, has become the most famous teenager in 3 counties. The irony isn't lost on him as he lies in bed, staring at the ceiling, while his phone buzzes with friend requests from people who couldn't remember his name yesterday. Fame he's discovering, is another kind of invisibility, the kind where everyone sees you, but nobody really knows who you are. Tomorrow will bring consequences he can't imagine: media attention, administrative meetings, questions from strangers, and expectations from peers. The quiet life he's carefully constructed is over, replaced by something public and complicated and completely beyond his control. But tonight, in the darkness of his room, Ethan allows himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The photograph of his grandfather sits on his nightstand, the red marker defacement carefully cleaned away, the dignified face restored to its proper honor. "I hope I did right, abuelo," he whispers to the silence. And somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, he swears he can feel the old man's approval, warming the room like sunlight. Because sometimes, the most important battles aren't the ones you choose, they're the ones that choose you.